Hi there. So, it's been a while. I'm not sure exactly how long, but as you can see, I've got my sweater on and we're into the winter months. By the way, I'm Jen. This is my autoimmune path. Welcome. It kind of looked like from my other videos, because I always had on short sleeves, that it was summer. But honestly, that was for me into the fall. It was just warmer weather. But we've been through Thanksgiving here and it's now December, so hence the sweater. It's actually very cold today. What I would like to talk about, my topic, the title is your coffee moldy? So we're going to do kind of a dive and explore all of that. Now, coffee, it's everywhere, right? Like, I don't know, it's just kind of blown up, you know. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, certainly coffee was very prevalent, but I feel like it was kind of basic, you know. We just had just kind of your basic coffee with cream and sugar, basic kind of coffee makers at home to brew pot. And, you know, pretty much, at least around where I lived, you just kind of bought your coffee at the grocery. It was pre-ground, came in a can, usually a metal can. It was either kind of, you went usually the Folgers route or the Maxwell House route. My family tended to be the Maxwell House route, but anyway. So now coffee's everywhere. Tons of coffee shops, tons of options, all kinds of frou-frou coffees, lattes, mochas, I don't even know. But anyway, something that, you know, we never really thought about, like when I was growing up, was coffee moldy? Like, am I drinking moldy coffee? And I don't know if people didn't really know about the mold and the mycotoxins. So I don't know if that's sort of like, as science developed, then they were able to measure that, or if it just wasn't out there because people weren't as concerned about it. And you may be thinking, well, when I open my bag of coffee, I don't see mold on it, so what's the big deal? Well, the deal is that certain agricultural crops and products can have microscopic mold, and that can be on coffee beans. Now, coffee doesn't start out, you know, as the beans. It starts out as what they call these cherries. It's this kind of, you know, it almost looks like a literal cherry. It's just kind of this round red thing. These cherries are harvested when they're ripe, and then they're taken to be processed. And it's not necessarily a complex process, but it's a lot of steps. So just to kind of simplify though, there are 2 or 3 types of processing. There's wet processing, and then there's dry processing, and then there's kind of some really in between. One of them's called like honey processing, which, as far as I can research, I don't think it really has much to do with actual honey. They have to like get that outer cherry part off, and there's some like kind of they call it like mucilage that's around the bean, and then all that has to kind of be like taken off, rinsed off, especially if they're using the water process. Then the beans have to be dried out. And then you get, when it's down to about 11% moisture, you get what's called the green coffee beans. And then those are sold, and companies or businesses get those in, and then they roast them kind of how they want to be roasted. In that whole process where the coffee's going from those ripe, kind of cherry things that come off, that are picked off the tree, to the green coffee bean that's ready to be roasted, some mold can grow. And again, it's microscopic, but it can grow on the beans. Well, and let me just say, okay, what is mold? And I feel like everybody kind of tends to know what mold is. Like, we've all seen mold probably on bread, moldy bread and things like that. But mold is basically just a fungus. Mold then actually can produce what's called mycotoxins. That can happen on coffee. Mycotoxins are not good for you. And the reason that we would want to be concerned about all of that, the mold and the mycotoxins in this community, and as far as this episode, is because we're talking about autoimmune disease. And so this falls in that category of lessening the load that I talk about. I've got 2 episodes about things that you can do to kind of lessen the load, because our bodies are fighting so much these days. If you have an autoimmune disease, your body is fighting itself, number one. Then we're having to kind of fight against all these chemicals out there. There's chemicals and toxins in so much. It's in our food. It can be possibly in our water. It can be in things like our fabrics, like say on furniture, like some kind of a protective coating that's even sprayed on fabrics, or there might be some type of waterproofing on clothes or shoes. Just there's all kinds of things, and it can disrupt our endocrine system. You've heard of probably endocrine disruptors and things like that. Especially if you're a coffee drinker, you don't want to be ingesting microscopic mold and possible mycotoxins every single day, because while it's not necessarily going to kill you, it's just not that great. So, well, what's the answer? There are actually several companies out there. I don't know how many. I personally kind of know of probably at least 4 or 5 coffee companies who are, in the United States, and they sell coffee that has been tested. So they actually will take the batches of beans and test them for this mold and these mycotoxins. Now, I don't know what these kind of levels are, like the threshold for the levels and all of that. It seemed like from my research that some of the, approved levels, like you want it under a certain amount, are kind of, we may take our cue from, say, Europe, where there may be a little bit more stringent about it. And I don't think there's any possible way to guarantee that any coffee would be maybe like 100% mold or mycotoxin free, but you want a very low amount. And interestingly enough, in my research, I also found that, and I think I may have referenced this earlier, but that other agricultural crops can have this microscopic mold and mycotoxins on them. Like, for instance, apples, so that would translate to apple juice as well, celery, dried fruit, peanuts, and grains. So, wheat, corn, rice, millet, rye. And so that is a whole nother good reason to avoid grains. Now, I'm not trying to give you any kind of, dietary advice, but we know that a lot of grains in the United States are very genetically modified. They're very heavily sprayed with pesticides and things. And then if you have to worry about the possibility of some mold and mycotoxins, that's a lot. So I had mentioned several episodes ago that our family has been trying to eat as much as possible grain free, and we even kind of dabbled a little bit into the carnivore realm, but we've kind of landed for the most part kind of doing like keto or paleo. But you don't typically eat grain with that. And so I'm just saying, like, if it's something where you want to try to avoid stuff like the mold and mycotoxins, then you need to, take a look at it as far as the coffee that you're choosing, and then you may want to avoid grains, and you don't have to be maybe diet hard about it, but you could kind of do the 80-20 thing where 80% of the food you eat is not grains, and maybe 20% is. Maybe you have a cheat day here and there, whatever. It is just something to consider for sure. Now, I want to kind of back up and give like an example of how we first as a family kind of got into this, or sort of realized that coffee actually could have mold and mycotoxins. And I think we learned about that probably about 6-7 years ago. But I will say that it was kind of interesting because we used to use just a regular coffee maker. Nothing super fancy. I mean, a pretty good quality one, but it was just kind of your basic coffee maker. And, we would always grind the beans. We'd grind them. We'd put them in the little kind of filter basket. You can use paper filters, or you can use these kind of gold-toned, kind of funnel-shaped filter baskets, and you put the grounds down in there, and then once you've brewed your pot of coffee, then you take that filter basket out and dump the used grounds, and then rinse that gold-tone filter basket out. But there were occasions, and I guess this would usually happen because, like, my husband is more of a coffee drinker than I am. I certainly drink it, but I'm more of like a hot tea person. And so, but he travels a lot for work. And when he's home, kind of one of our routines, or just things that we like to do together, is to have coffee in the morning. If he's here, I will have coffee with him. If he's traveling for work, I will usually just make myself some hot tea. So let's just say I would brew a pot of coffee, or however much we would brew, and then we'd have our coffee that morning. Then maybe the next day he would have left to go out of town, and I forgot to dump those coffee grounds out. Well, then the next time we made coffee, and it might be 3 or 4 days later, I'd go lift that thing up on the coffee maker, the little lid, look down in there, and there would be like this kind of light covering of mold. I don't know if y'all have ever had that experience happen to you, but it would happen occasionally with us. I guess I didn't think a whole lot about it because, things do mold, and the grounds had been run through, water, and it was kind of in a hot environment, like a hot, moist environment, which I guess I just figured, that made it grow mold. But I guess I didn't really think too much else about it. Like, how did that get on there in the first place? And like, did it have mold already on there? Well, I think the answer is probably yes, because if it's microscopic, you're not going to see it, but it had to be on there ahead of time for then to grow to the point where you actually do see it. So I'm not saying that that's this overwhelming proof, but for me, it really gave me pause. You know, I thought back to that happening and thought, okay, I get it now. I really do. I get it. So, and it was, you know, it was always kind of this big thing where I would get frustrated with myself because it's like, I forgot to dump that out. And then I'd have to, you know, rinse that gold tone filter like in really, really hot water. And then a lot of times I would run a cycle through the coffee maker just to kind of clean it. Like maybe I would just run several rounds of water, or I'd run some water and vinegar through, you know, but I would just like, I didn't want any of that to be mold contaminated. But anyway, we first started kind of hearing about, you know, this kind of mold-free, mycotoxin-free. And it was in reference to a particular brand that was advertised. And so we thought, well, hey, let's check it out. And like I said, this was probably about 6 or 7 years ago. And that particular company, at first, they only had one roast, you know. Now they have all kinds of roasts. They have, you know, they have decaf, and they have a light roast and a very dark roast, and it kind of anything in between. But at that point, they just had one roast, because we were kind of more in still that category of just buying our coffee at the grocery store, which there's nothing wrong with that. But or we might buy it kind of at a little bit more specialty place. I know when my husband would travel for work, sometimes he would go to, and I'm not going to name the retailer, but it's kind of this specialty grocery store. And we don't have one in the area where we live in our state. But he'd get these cans of beans. And like I said, we would always grind them, you know, right before we would brew a pot of coffee. And so he might pick up, say, 6 or 8 cans of those beans, and then that would last us, who knows, you know, maybe 5 or 6 months. And while some of that might have been organic, which that's a good step, it's a step in the right direction, it certainly wasn't marketed as mold or mycotoxin free. So when we found this other brand, we started ordering it kind of just a little bit here and there. Like they would have a really good Black Friday deal. And so we would buy, you know, an amount, and it would maybe last us, say, through the first quarter of the year. And then we'd just kind of go back to like whatever coffee we could get at either the grocery store or, you know, maybe at kind of a big box store. But recently, I'd say in the past year or two, we really just felt like we wanted to kind of make a permanent change and order that kind of coffee all the time. And like I said, they have a lot more variety now. They don't have flavors. They just have certain roasts, and you know, they'll sometimes come out with a specialty roast or a specialty blend, maybe around the holidays and things like that. So we've got it on auto delivery, which we really don't do a whole lot of auto delivery type stuff, but it's super easy. We get 3 bags of the beans. I think it's every quarter, and that usually gets us through. Now, if I was drinking it every day, or if, you know, my husband were here like every morning, I don't know that would get us through that whole quarter. But with me not drinking coffee every day and him traveling, it works out pretty well. And the one we have is a fairly light roast. And it's really, really good. Just, Google mold-free coffee, mold/mycotoxin-free coffee, and you'll probably get a lot of options that'll come up. I'm not going to recommend any brands here, but like I said, there's probably a good 4 or 5 brands that I know of personally. And honestly, it's probably going to just be more and more popular as time goes on, because as we discussed earlier, with us being such a coffee-centric kind of society now, like, I think, and people more and more coming down with autoimmune conditions, it's like we're not going to really want to give up our coffee, and maybe you don't have to if you can switch to that. Another thing I want to just kind of point out is to talk about how, and this wasn't like years and years ago when I first started drinking coffee, and that was probably in college. That's probably when most people start. Although these days, with all the frou drinks, it might even be earlier, in the teenage years. Coffee didn't make me jittery or anything. And I've really never had issues, with caffeine. Some people, like for instance, our daughter, are extremely caffeine sensitive. I don't think I fall into that category. But I did notice that, kind of as I got older, heading more into middle age, that if I had a second cup of coffee, that I would kind of get jittery, and it would kind of just mess with my blood sugar almost, or something. Just, I didn't feel great if I had that second cup. And I wasn't really sure what to attribute that to. I thought, well, maybe it's the caffeine, but then that didn't make a whole lot of sense, because, say, with soda and stuff, which I try not to drink hardly any soda these days, but I mean, I used to, in my younger years, I used to drink a lot of soda. It never really seemed to have an issue with the caffeine sensitivity. And so that didn't really, it just didn't really fit. But I have since learned that probably what the reason was, it could have been the mold and the mycotoxins, because that can absolutely affect you that way. And so it was probably like my body was okay with just the 1 cup, and then once I added the other cup in, then, it was like, okay, I think my body was saying, enough of that. I don't want to eat any more mold and mycotoxins, and it just was reacting to it, possibly. I don't really know. It's just something interesting to think about. Let me tell you what some of these molds are. The one that I think is maybe the most prevalent, or here's a couple that could, I think, be pretty prevalent, is aflatoxin. Then there's also something called ochratoxin A. If you can find, a good brand, and that they batch test every batch, and that the levels are low, and they're, it's basically mold and mycotoxin free. Again, it may not be 100%, but it's low enough to where it's probably not going to bother you. It could be a game changer for you. Like, you may have thought, oh, I just can't drink coffee anymore. Well, you may can, if you can find the right kind that's tested for that. Also, I would highly recommend organic coffee. And usually, if a brand is going to market itself, and not just marketing, I mean, it's not that they're just saying this, they actually do it. But if a brand is going to guarantee it to be mold and mycotoxin free, 9 times out of 10 is going to be organic as well. Because if they care enough about all the testing, then they're probably going to care about it being organic as well. And that's just an extra layer, right? Then you're not having to worry about the chemicals or pesticides or something in your coffee either. So it's you know, it's kind of like a whole rabbit hole that you can go down. Let's see, what else? Oh, some of these articles where I found some research, I will link those in the show notes. I will mention that one article, the guy who wrote it, he had looked at a lot of studies about coffee consumption and mold and everything. The studies I discovered only showed that about 53% of coffees tested contained mold. So that's a fair amount. That's over half. But he says not at levels high enough to be toxic. So again, you're not worried about it, you know, killing you or like making you violently ill or anything like that. But I just feel like day after day, if you're drinking coffee that has mold contaminant and mycotoxins, it's just not really a great thing. Why put that in your body if there are options out there on the market? So I would highly, highly recommend you sourcing a good mold / mycotoxin free coffee that is organic. And I think it just might change your life, especially if you just really love coffee. So I think that's about all I have on that subject. And if you have any questions, please ask them or let me know in the comments if, you know, what, like, I'm not asking for brands, but do you drink coffee that is mold and mycotoxin free? Has it made a huge difference for you like it has made for me? Just, I would love to hear about it. Okay? All right. Well, thank you so much for listening. Talk to you later. Bye.